Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm going to continue my ongoing series UFOs in Your Hometown. This episode is called UFOs in Your Hometown Episode 6. I am doing this for you guys. I put out a challenge quite some time ago. Name any town, any city, any place on this planet, and I can find a history of UFO encounters there. And I'm still batting 100%. I've got a list now of about 600 locations, so please have mercy on me if you're going to provide any more locations. It's going to take me some time to get there. But I've got 10 locations that you guys provided. I'm going down the list in order. And I found encounters in all of them. And not only encounters, but the full range of them. Sightings, landings, humanoids, onboard experiences, close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, fourth kind. These cases are supported by pretty much the full variety of evidence we have out there. So there are photographic cases, some really interesting ones, radar returns, certainly landing traces, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, and physiological effects. Quite a bit of humanoid encounters. I find those the most interesting, so don't worry about that. There are some there. Now, the locations I am covering today include Benson, Arizona, also Greensboro, North Carolina, Edwardsburg, Michigan, Bedfordshire in the UK, also Chicoutimi, Canada, this is in Quebec, Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, Asheville, North Carolina, both Juneau and Skagway in Alaska, and finally Bradenton, Florida. So thanks to all of you who provided these locations. I always have fun exploring these new places on our planet and finding new cases. This is going to be a long episode. Let's get started. And the first location I will be exploring today is Benson, Arizona. This is by a special request of Cliff Olinger. Didn't find as many as I hoped, but I found a few, and they're definitely interesting. One of the first major cases in Benson, Arizona occurred on April 3rd, 1952. And the main witness is Chick Logan. He's a good witness, a civilian flight commander. He was on the runway at Marana Air Base. He was waiting for a radio transmission from one of his students, and this is when he noticed a strange oval light in the sky. Now, he didn't pay too much attention to it at first, but then several other people there also noticed it, and they pointed out that it wasn't moving. So Chick Logan decided he was going to take off and intercept it, which he did, and he climbed up to an altitude of about 14,000 feet. He was not equipped to go any higher, and this object was much higher. He estimates that it was about 40,000 feet altitude. Chick Logan described it as about 5 times the size of a B-29 Super Fortress, so pretty big. And as he says, it was not like a disc, but more oblong. It was real bright and shone like polished aluminum. I'll tell you, I have been flying for 25 years, and I have never seen anything like it. So this object remained over the base for nearly an hour before disappearing. There was a possibility that this was a weather balloon, though it certainly didn't look like it, and further research revealed that no, there were no weather balloon launches that might have caused this sighting. And here's another one, 4 years later. September 26, 1956, members of the Ground Observer Corps, whose job it is to identify aircraft, actually saw a fleet of glowing objects move over Tucson heading towards Benson. And sure enough, people in Benson saw it as well, because the Benson, Arizona newspaper called the center to report that a group of 12 objects in a, quote, diamond-shaped formation had just gone over their town, moving faster than any jet. So again, definitely unidentified. And here's a real recent one. On the evening of May 13, 2022, a man from Benson captured a strange light in the sky on his trail cam, which he set up near his home. Here's the weird thing. Only 2 frames show this object, so whatever it was, it came and went pretty quickly. So there you go, Cliff. Sorry I couldn't find more, but in all honesty, that's a pretty small town. And the cases I did find are pretty well verified, and there's a photographic case, so I find that pretty interesting. Let's move to the next location. This is by special request of Pogo Joe. So this is for you, Pogo Joe. I am exploring Greensboro, North Carolina. And I have to tell you, Greensboro delivered big time. Sightings, landings, humanoids, onboard encounters, landing traces, photos, the whole deal. So I had a really good time exploring Greensboro. The first Greensboro case that I could find comes from researcher George D. Fawcett, a highly respected researcher. And he was given this account by two sisters, Dr. Catherine I. Rankin and her sister, a schoolteacher, Mary Frances Rankin. Now, they were not the witnesses. In fact, the witnesses were their parents who told them this story. This incident occurred one day in May 1930 during broad daylight when Mr. and Miss Rankin saw a UFO land in the backyard of their home on Pearson Street. They said this object was moving both horizontally and vertically in the sky, and then it landed. Now they could see that it was shaped like a top, dark in color, pretty big, about 40 feet wide, and there was definitely something inside of it because looking at it, they were startled to see through a window the head and shoulders of an occupant. He wore a tight-fitting garment, dark in color, a tight-fitting helmet over his head, and they watched him and this object for a good 5 to 10 minutes, when without warning, this object rose vertically in perfect silence and moved off into the distance. So it was much later that Mr. and Mrs. Rankin shared this sighting with their two daughters, and it was they who shared it with researcher George Fawcett. And here's another. July 7, 1947. This is around the exact same time as the famous Roswell crash in New Mexico. It was at 6:30 a.m. and Albert Riggs, a soldier, was driving near the Greensboro High Point Airport along with another soldier who he had picked up, a hitchhiker. And together they saw three gray-black discs moving overhead. These were moving in a triangular formation, pretty low in the sky, 200 to 300 feet high, and they were swerving from side to side in this weird motion. They both heard this, quote, zipping noise, and these objects whizzed by them at an estimated 500 miles per hour and disappeared off into the distance. Here's another one about 5 years later, 8:45 a.m., another daylight sighting, September 22nd, 1952. Dr. Franklin McNutt, who is the dean of University of North Carolina, he and his wife were in the yard of their home on McConnell Road. This is just east of downtown Greensboro, and they saw a plane passing overhead heading for the airport. And this is when Franklin's wife said, "Do you see something ahead of the plane?" And looking up, Franklin did, a silver-colored object, which was motionless for a moment and then darted off at very high speed. So after it disappeared, he went inside and called the Weather Bureau, who said that they didn't know what it was, there were no weather balloons. So he called the airport, who verified the plane he had seen coming in for a landing. But they said that the pilot made no report of any UFO. But then, and this is interesting, the tower official added, kind of enigmatically, pilots have stopped reporting flying saucers because they don't want to be laughed at. So the implication was that this pilot could very well have seen something but didn't want to talk about it. 3 years later, another wave of sightings. On April 21st, 1955, Greensboro police and the weather bureaus were swamped with calls by people reporting a flash of intense blue light, followed a few minutes later by a thunderous explosion. This was at 2 a.m. It woke up many people in Greensboro. They never did find out what it was. There was speculation that it might have been a meteor, but this was never confirmed. Now here's a really fascinating case. You might not realize it, but the most popular day for UFOs is actually July 4th. Independence Day. And you might think, oh, this is just fireworks. Not necessarily. I did a whole episode on 4th of July sightings. This is a thing. And it happened in Greensboro. On July 4, 1963, one adult and a group of boys were watching a fireworks show, and this is when a strange craft showed up. The adult reported it anonymously to the Air Force, and I'll just quote him directly. As he says, "I noticed the UFO to the north. I observed it for 2 minutes as it moved silently eastward, then suddenly reversed direction as it picked up speed. Then, assuming its original course once again, it moved slowly upwards and out of sight. It was very large, and was yellow or orange with a row of red lights at its perimeter. I don't claim that the UFO was extraterrestrial, but its size and pattern of light would suggest it was not a conventional craft." One evening in late September 1966, numerous people, including police officers, reported very fast-moving star-like objects. Now these were changing in color, from blue to red and white and back again, and they were seen not only over Greensboro, but over Winston-Salem, Asheboro, Ramseur, and other areas. Now Marine officials, when contacted, suggested that these might be flares. But witnesses were able to locate another military officer who did not want his name used, and he said that no, it was very unlikely these were flares. These sightings were too far inland. Flares were not being dropped there at that time. Now here's a case of direct contact. This one occurred in September of 1966 to a gentleman by the name of David Oldham. He lived in Greensboro. He was 16 years old when he and two friends were driving near Guilford Courthouse National Military Park on their way to a local nightclub. And this is when they came upon a huge light, quote, sitting right on the trees. It was very low, and as they watched it, it kind of swung back and forth in this weird pendulum-like movement. Now, this is when David felt a strange near paralysis grip him, almost like he was frozen, and the next thing they knew, all three were arriving at the club, but mysteriously 2 hours had elapsed without any idea of where the time went. So yeah, a clear-cut case of missing time associated with a very close-up encounter. Huge red flag here. Now, it took years for David Oldham to connect this with a possible UFO encounter, and having had other experiences, he finally decided to contact Bud Hopkins, the famous researcher, and Bud Hopkins arranged for him to undergo hypnotic regression. And under hypnosis, David Oldham recalled an onboard encounter. He recalls seeing this object in the sky, and suddenly gray-type ETs, short little figures with large heads and dark eyes, were approaching the car. David got out of the back seat. He doesn't recall exactly how he got on board this craft. He suddenly found himself inside it, inside a small cylindrical room. It was well lit, but there was no lamps or lights that he could see. He was put on a table as several grays surrounded him, and as he says, they all had large heads, and they had these tremendously big eyes. I mean, it reminded you of a cat eye. So these beings examined him, passing an instrument with lights over his body. He was then physically levitated, he said, to another room. He didn't walk. They kind of floated him around. They took him to this other room and showed him a box with weird hieroglyphic-like symbols on it. And it seemed to be very important because the Greys told him, one of them told him telepathically, "Remember this." They then left him alone for a short time in this room. Dave is looking around and he saw this other, slightly larger box, and he felt something telling him not to touch it, but he did anyway, and he regretted it because it physically shocked him. As David says, it was like I was shocked out of my skin, like touching a live wire. So at this point, the ETs escorted him from the craft, and David began crying. And this is when one of the ETs turned to him and said, "Why are you crying? Why are you showing this emotion?" And David replied, "Because I've never felt love like this before." He elaborated to Bud Hopkins and said, "It was like, at one point, we connected in unconditional love." So this was ultimately a very positive encounter. He was returned to the car where his two friends sat in a non-responsive trance, completely unaware of David's absence. So this was one of many encounters he had, and in fact, later, David's story was featured in Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time. He did find strange landing traces in his yard at one point, a mysteriously crushed tree, a 13-foot wide circular depression, but it was this experience at age 16 that really impacted him the most. As he says, "All I know is something happened to me. I don't totally understand it. I probably never will. I'm sure one day I'll come at peace with it. And until I do, I'm going to keep searching." So the encounters in Greensboro continue. It was on the night of November 2nd, 1973, that residents near the intersection of Lee Street and Silver Avenue, which you can see here, called the police because there was this egg-shaped object hovering only about 15 feet, they estimate, above their home. It was changing colors, it was circling around, and it was staying there for quite some time. The police arrived just in time to see this object as it moved off. And it was just 2 weeks later, 6:30 p.m., November 14, that at least 9 additional witnesses observed a UFO again in Greensboro. One of them was Sharon McIntyre. She was with her husband, and they were alerted to something unusual when their dog became upset. So looking outside to see why, this is when they saw a glowing object hovering. It was darting back and forth, up and down, and did so for a full 15 minutes, long enough for them to alert their neighbors, the miners, who also saw it. In fact, they all got in their cars and chased this object down the street. Their other neighbors, the Andrews, also saw this object. They all described it as about 25 to 40 feet wide, maybe 5 to 8 feet high, was changing colors. And unknown to all of them, there was in fact another witness, Mr. Harold Hopper, who you can see here. He also saw this object. So this is a really well-verified, multi-witness case. And the cases continue. Here's another one. June 16, 1973, 3 witnesses in Greensboro saw a disc-shaped object drop down to a low elevation. It hovered for 8 minutes and actually landed briefly on the ground, immediately ascended upwards, darted around, and moved off. So going to where this object had landed, depressions were found in the grass, apparently where this object had touched down. More cases. January 12, 1986, Scott and Tina Kay reported their sighting of no less than 10 glowing disc-shaped objects flying in this weird shifting formation directly over Greensboro. Then, on March 4, 1992, a meteorologist by the name of Corey Lefkoff observed a red-orange object moving slowly and silently and seeming to stop in place at one point. And he did some research and found out that another airport guard saw it as well. Some years later, on the night of May 29, 1994, an insurance company vice president, he wants to remain anonymous, said he saw a red light moving horizontally, stopping, and then darting away at meteoric speed. He and at least 2 others watched it, sometimes through binoculars, still were not able to identify it, and finally it moved off. It was just a few months later, on November 26, 1994, another Greensboro resident used binoculars to observe what he described as a cylindrical object with a green flashing light in the middle. He watched it for 30 minutes. It's a long time. At one point, it seemed to split into 2. He couldn't tell for sure because at this point it was obscured by clouds, and he lost sight of it. Moving along, January 24, 2004, a Greensboro couple watched a single glowing object, which they said came straight down vertically out of the sky, moved closer to them, then moved straight up and blinked out. Yes, a brief sighting, but certainly unusual. Here's another, much more recent case. February 7, 2014. A man was driving by the Greensboro airport and saw a plane taking off, and this is when he noticed a disc-shaped craft not too far from the jet. And as he watched, this object sped back and forth at a very high rate of speed and then disappeared. And I want to just briefly mention 3 additional cases in Greensboro because these all involve photographs. One gentleman was photographing the moon. This was on February 3rd, 2015. Now, he didn't see anything unusual while taking these photographs, but looking at the digital photos, he did notice 2 strange objects. You can see them here. You can make up your own minds about it. 4 years later, January 25, 2019, a man was outside looking at the birds, and this is when he noticed a strange light in the sky. He quickly grabbed his camera and photographed this strange cylindrical object you can see here. Now, the most recent case occurred on October 20th, 2022, when a weird glowing cloud-like object was seen moving around and hovering at low altitude above a shopping mall. And you can see from these 2 photographs that it is moving around and yet still maintaining its shape. It's certainly unusual. Okay, Pogo Joe, I hope you found that interesting. Thanks very much. I had a lot of fun exploring Greensboro, lots of cases there. Loved the photographic cases. I'm really surprised that there are still any skeptics whatsoever on this planet. I mean, seriously, if you can find a history of encounters pretty much everywhere, what does that say? This is far, far more common than most people realize, especially when you consider the fact that most people don't even report their encounters, which is especially true if it's a major one involving humanoids or an onboard encounter or something that's got high strangeness to it. So let's move to the next location, which is by special request of Philip. Philip, this is for you. I am exploring Edwardsburg, Michigan. And this one was a toughie. I didn't find a whole lot. Again, a pretty small town. So I did find some. Still batting 1,000%. As I said, Edwardsburg is a pretty small town. Less than 2,000 people. So I'm amazed I found any cases. But I did, and they're quite strange. Most of them occurred in 2008. The first was on May 22nd, 2008. And it was about 3:30 p.m. when a man was driving along State Highway 12 near the Brush Road on-ramp when he saw a triangular-shaped object zoom right over his car. He says it was less than 50 feet overhead. He in fact pulled over to watch it, and as he says, and I quote, "I sat in complete astonishment that this was actually happening as the object glided toward the ground at my car. It traveled the distance from horizon to above my car so fast I didn't even have time to blink. I watched as this now quite visible equilateral triangle with a semicircle cut out in the back flew in a matter of 10 to 15 feet above my car. The object must have been about twice as long and twice as wide as my car and emitted no sound, but it had 3 lights on the bottom, one in each corner of the triangle. The lights seemed to be streaming down like strobe lights until it banked onto its side. When it did this, I got a clear view of the bottom and noticed that the lights were about the size of a dinner plate. So he wasn't the only one who was watching this. He saw 2 other cars pull over. And it was less than 1 month later on June 10, 2008, when a witness was near Eagle Lake, which you can see here. He described seeing a metallic-looking, kind of balloon-shaped object. The thing was glowing red underneath. There were 2 of them. One was moving very quickly, and the other seemed to change shape, kind of transforming to a triangular-shaped object. And it quickly dropped from the sky, and that was the last he saw of both of these objects. It was only 1 day later, this time at 11:30 p.m. on June 11, 2008, that a witness reported a very large cigar-shaped object glowing bright orange, hovering just above the treetops for about 5 minutes, and then disappearing. He says this was the 3rd time he had seen it, and that on a prior occasion it disappeared just as another plane approached. Lots of cases of that, UFOs darting off when another aircraft comes near. And here's a final case, quite odd. This occurred on December 1st, 2022, when a witness saw what he thought was a meteor, sort of a light blue fireball with a long white tail. But here's the thing, as it headed down, almost coming in for a landing, it suddenly made, quote, an extreme right turn, and then it took off at, quote, extremely high speed. So clearly not a shooting star, as they don't make right turns. Not like that. There you go, Philip. That's Edwardsburg, Michigan for you. No, I couldn't find any humanoid cases or onboard cases, just sightings, but still, I think this proves that UFOs have visited Edwardsburg. Now let's move to the next location. This is by special request of Ginger. And this location is Bedfordshire, England. And wow, Ginger, I have to thank you for pointing out this location because this one absolutely delivered many amazing cases, sightings, face-to-face contact with humanoids, and more. And some really unusual cases. In fact, there was one so unusual, I had to save it for a separate episode. I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into it. So stay tuned. There will be more cases coming from Bedfordshire. But here's the ones I found. The earliest case I could find in Bedfordshire is quite strange. This is direct contact, and boy, this is a weird one. It occurred in November of 1956 when John Whitworth, who owned a business at 26 High Street in Shefford, Bedfordshire, you can see it here, reports that a strange-looking gentleman, human-looking, but with a very large, high forehead, he entered his shop and really surprised John by purchasing a handkerchief with exact change. This was odd because this article was not displayed, nor was the price displayed. This was weird. But even more odd was what happened next, because this customer told John that if he wanted to see a flying saucer, he should go to a certain bridge near Biggleswade on November 28, 1956. So this intrigued John. He followed the instructions, went to this location, and was amazed to see a top-shaped object with glowing portholes fly overhead, stop, hover, and dart off. Now, the story is not over yet, because it was 1 year later that this same strange customer visited John again in his shop and told him this time to go to a spot near the big water tower on Toppler's Hill, and that he would have direct contact with the ETs. This was on November 27, 1957 at 8 p.m. The customer said that they would appear over John's home on the night of contact. And sure enough, on December 1st, 1957, a UFO appeared over John's home. Now, John alerted a lot of people. He went with a convoy of cars, including a news van, to this spot. But to his disappointment, nothing showed up. So everyone dispersed, he returned home, and this is when he received a very strange phone call. A male voice said, quote, "You were very foolish tonight," and it began to reprimand him for bringing other people along to the meeting place. So John listened to this with quite some astonishment. He handed the phone to someone else. The voice wouldn't speak and said only, the message was for John Whitworth alone. So such a shame. Could have been direct contact there, but it was aborted. Here's another really interesting case. 7:30 p.m. on December 14, 1957. A gentleman by the name of John Jordan, who owned an electric mill, noticed this round white light shining beams of light down onto his electric mill. It hovered in place and then darted away at an estimated 100 miles per hour, hovered again, and moved off. This was interesting because only 1 week earlier, John was flying in a plane over his home in Bedfordshire, and he saw a very similar, if not identical looking object. Now, according to the editors of the Flying Saucer Review, where this account was published, other sightings had occurred recently in this area. And they continued, because it was one day in July of 1962, this time at the Luton area of Bedfordshire, two sisters, aged 7 and 3.5, were playing in their backyard. And this is when they saw a cigar-shaped object hovering and descending to very low altitude. This frightened them. This was not a normal-looking craft. So they ran inside their home and watched from the kitchen window. And looking at this object, were amazed to see two human-looking men with very pale skin, straight blonde hair. They were wearing silver blue outfits. And the occupants of this craft stared briefly at the witnesses. And after this, the object quickly rose upwards and was gone. Here's another case 2 years later, 10:30 p.m., November 5, 1964. Taxi driver John Hodges was driving in Bedfordshire when he saw a brilliant star-like object with beams of light radiating from it. It was star-like, but much too big to be a star, and it remained hovering in place for more than an hour. And at one point, and this gave it away, it started making this weird, strange, pendulum-like movement, so clearly not a star. John was not the only witness. He brought 2 other people who also watched it. They observed it for a full hour and 15 minutes when it suddenly glided away and disappeared over the horizon. So just another UFO hanging out. All right, here is another case. It was late one evening in April 1971 when pilot and flight instructor Les Seymour had a very interesting UFO encounter near Tottenham, again in Bedfordshire. He saw this brilliant green-blue object, which he said was 5 times brighter than a star, and it looked like it was about 20,000 feet altitude, so quite high up there. But it flew in from the southeast, it stopped and hovered, it winked out, flared up, moved overhead, then it zipped off at a fantastic speed. He said it made no sound whatsoever, was in view for a full 20 seconds. Here's the thing, Les is very familiar with aircraft. He's a trained observer. He estimates that this object was about 40 to 50 feet in diameter, pretty large, and as it moved off so quickly, he estimated its speed at about 25,000 miles per hour. Clearly not one of our own. Now here's another case, same year. This occurred on the night of November 9, 1971. Barry Coogan reported his sighting of an object over the Goldington School. He says, and I quote, "I thought it was an aircraft at first, but it stopped overhead for a few seconds, and then it went really bright. After that, it shot off, and I didn't see it again." It's a lot of UFOs hovering over schools. I did a whole episode on that. So that looks like another schoolyard encounter, though there's only a single witness. Now, here is another somewhat harrowing case. This occurred one cold night in November 1980 when a mother and her teenage daughter were feeding their horses in the field by their farm in rural Bedfordshire. And this is when they noticed a bright round light that was moving slowly and quickly across the ground, almost at ground level in the neighbor's field. In fact, it seemed to be exploring the field. By the way it was moving, the witnesses were absolutely convinced it was unusual. It was moving very quickly and gliding. Now suddenly it turned towards them, and it lit the area around them like daylight. The horses were not reacting in any way. The object was totally silent. So they watched this when, without warning, it winked out, and then it reappeared much farther across the field, continued to scan the ground, and then vanished and reappeared again. So this frightened them. They ran inside and watched from inside as this light continued this behavior for a full 2 hours until finally disappearing for good. They did ask their neighbor about it the next day. He said he hadn't seen anything. He did check his field but found nothing unusual. Next case, August 17, 1987. A lady by the name of Gay Pollard was driving with her sister to the Luton Airport in Bedfordshire when they both saw a circular object with a kind of V-shaped side to it, 3 blinking lights. They could not identify it, and neither, as it turned out, could the police, who they called, and the police had no information. But as Gay says, "I have always scoffed at the idea of flying saucers, but I couldn't make sense of what we saw. At first I thought it was a low airplane, then a balloon. But both me and my sister are convinced that it couldn't have been either of these." Here's another brief case, October 1988. A woman living on Beach Avenue in Biggleswade said that she saw a strange object hovering overhead. This is just a tiny little street. You can see it here. But as she says, quote, "It was shaped like a balloon, but moved too fast to be one. It was silver and shining, with red and bright yellow-orange lights." Now here is a very weird case, somewhat concerning. It occurred to a family of 5 while driving through Bedfordshire on August 8, 1992. The kids were in the back seat singing Beatles songs. The father, Mr. B, we don't know their names, they're anonymous, he noticed this thick wall of mist ahead of them on the road, and he had no choice but to drive into it. And when he did, something very strange happened. All sound stopped. The kids were no longer singing. They couldn't hear the car engine, nothing. They popped out immediately on the other side and right into a huge downpour of rain. So it went from good weather to just pouring rain, which was very odd. And all of them were severely disoriented. In fact, Mr. B felt like he might have lost control of the car for a moment. He wondered if he had had an accident. They found themselves 8 miles further down the road. It took them a second to orient themselves to that. There was no traffic at this point. All the traffic was mysteriously absent. So they stopped to get gas. And this is when they realized they were missing about 20 minutes of time. So both Mr. and Mrs. B were still very disoriented, kind of dissociated. Miss B felt so strange that she actually wondered if perhaps they had been killed in a car accident and were now dead, wandering ghosts. But she surprised herself by suddenly blurting out, for no reason she could fathom, "I think it's happened. We've been in a flying saucer." It was later that night that Mr. B did notice a small mark on his abdomen and a small mark on the back of his wife's head. For the next few days, the whole family was strangely tired. They felt that time was kind of distorted. They all experienced a loss of appetite. It turns out Mrs. B does have a history of UFO encounters and strange events, including seeing humanoids in her bedroom. So this does sound like a missing time encounter. Now, one final case in Bedfordshire. A gentleman by the name of Peter Bowen began seeing UFOs near his home. He saw several of them, but the most dramatic one involved the sighting of a disc-shaped object, which he said was surrounded by this sort of black ball of smoke or mist. He said this object was hovering 300 feet overhead in the field directly behind the Luton Airport. He actually called the airport, and they told him that they knew nothing about it, that it had not been tracked on radar. But turns out Peter learned from a confidential source that this was a lie, that airport officials had in fact not only tracked this object on radar, but had been tracking strange targets for the past week. And as Peter says, these things are real, and they do exist. I have had quite a few sightings. There you go, Ginger. I hope that didn't disappoint. Bedfordshire, UK has definitely been visited, and like I said in the beginning, I have another report there that I'm going to take a look at in a future episode because it is just off the charts strange. So we have that to look forward to. Okay, what do we have next? We are looking at Chicoutimi in Quebec, Canada. This is by special request of Mike. Going all over the world here. Canada has definitely got its share of encounters. Chicoutimi, I didn't find a whole lot, but I found some, and I certainly think you will find them compelling. The first case I found in Chicoutimi involved a humanoid. It was about 8 p.m. one evening in April 1968, as a lady by the name of Miss Tremblay left her Chicoutimi home to go visit a restaurant. And as she left her home, she dropped her bag and looked up, saw a UFO. This object, she said, was only 300 feet above her, very low. It was sending down a beam of light. It appeared to be scanning the area. That was her impression. And then suddenly this beam of light came down directly on her. It was very bright. It caused her to close her eyes. Opening them moments later, she looked up. This UFO was now gone. So she returned inside her home, and just a few minutes later she saw something white moving outside her home, and turning to look at it, she saw this small, human-like being, only 6 feet away from her. She said that he appeared to be about 50 to 55 years old, but she was mostly struck by his dark blue eyes, which had this expression of sadness. This being was wearing a seamless white overall, no zippers, no buttons. But before she could alert anyone else in the house, this being vanished, and that was the end of the sighting. Another very interesting case comes from a Miss William Desneiges. It was around 1 a.m. on July 12, 1970, that she was in her home located on 61 Rue Vincent, which you can see here. And I'll just quote the witness directly. As she says, "I never believed in these stories before I saw this machine just 45 feet above the neighboring house. It seemed to move towards me. It had 4 arms in the form of a cross, and they were luminous. In the center was a rather strong telescopic light. It approached me, then departed calmly without making any noise. And I am not one of these young people who dream in color, I can assure you. I was not even in bed yet." One other case, very brief, occurred on October 14, 2003, and was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. The witness said that he saw a very large cylindrical-shaped object. He said it was 30 to 40 feet long and was flying, quote, really fast. He said it was only about 100 to 200 feet overhead, and off it went. So there's no other information about this case, but certainly intriguing. Right, there you go, Mike. Chicoutimi does have encounters. And yeah, it's only 3, but in my defense, one was a humanoid encounter. And I find the humanoid cases most interesting of all. Those in the on-board cases, of course. So many cases. And I have to tell you, yeah, I found only 3, but you can bet there's closer to 300. I've said it before, it bears repeating. Most people don't report their encounters. I wish they would. This subject would be far more accepted and mainstream if people found the courage to report their encounters. Certainly not blaming them. We're all victims of the UFO cover-up. Thankfully, that is beginning to end. We are seeing all these congressional hearings recently. It's pretty interesting. Times are changing. Now let's move to our next location, and that is Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas. This is by special request of Crypto Mojito. So this is for you, Crypto Mojito. Lots of really good cases. I think you'll find them pretty interesting. We will see. The earliest case I could find in the Dallas-Fort Worth area occurred in 1947. There's not a lot of information on this, but it is an occupant sighting, a humanoid sighting. A woman was driving on the outskirts of Fort Worth when she says she saw a 25-foot wide disc-shaped craft moving overhead. It impressed her enough to stop her car, so she jumps out and waves at this craft. Now, to her surprise, this craft tilted towards her, and she could see occupants inside. And these occupants actually waved right back at her, and then the craft flew away in perfect silence. Now, here's another very brief but a humanoid case, which comes from QFOS investigator Larry Sessions. Not a whole lot of information other than one summer evening in Dallas, a 12-year-old girl with the initials JD looked out the window of her home and saw a small humanoid being, she says, about the size of a 10-year-old boy. She said he had large, quote, friendly eyes, and he was wearing a skin-tight silver uniform. Now, this little girl stared at this being for a full 5 minutes, which is a long time, before it finally just walked away and moved out of sight, and that was that. Next case, 9:50 p.m. on August 24, 1972, 4 teenagers noticed a silver, disc-shaped object with a dome on top very near the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. So they did the right thing. They ran inside and got more witnesses, their parents, Mr. and Mrs. S.H. Lane, who came outside and they all saw it. They estimate this object was 30 feet wide with red and white lights and a row of portholes around this dome. The 6 witnesses watched this object for a full 7 minutes. until a group of 4 military jets approached, at which point the UFO moved in a wide circle and climbed silently upwards and was gone. Now, Mrs. Lane called the airport, who said it was probably a balloon. But, get this, Carswell Air Force Base said that they had actually received a report of a UFO from the Mexico tracking station and had sent the jets to investigate it. Now, 1974 brought a huge wave of sightings over the Dallas-Fort Worth area. On the morning of February 8, 1974, 4 airport employees spotted 5 objects right over the airport. One technician said, and I quote, "They were bigger and brighter than large stars. They were not any aircraft I know. They were clearly visible and appeared in a line as 5 flat flying saucers." Now, a tower supervisor said that their employees may have been observing, quote, "dust particles," which of course the witnesses totally rejected. Talk about debunking a sighting. But the sightings continued, and soon citizens living outside the airport began to report strange lights. One of them was medical technician Sandra Hodgson, who told reporters that she had seen many strange objects which seemed to be checking out the airport. As she says, after sighting the lights, which seemed to travel and hover at just above treetop level on several nights, I reported the UFOs to the FAA control tower at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Sandra and others watched one of these objects send down searchlights and apparently land in a field. And in fact, reporters heard about this, went to the area, and found a 20-foot wide circle of crushed vegetation swirled into a clockwise pattern. And throughout the next few months, these sightings continued. All kinds of people were reporting these objects, almost always describing them as hovering at treetop level right near the airport, sometimes landing next to the western boundary of the airport. Some of these witnesses began using flashlights to blink at these objects, which would reportedly blink back in response. So this is kind of like CE5 work. Here's another very unusual on-board case, which comes from author and researcher Cynthia L. Turnage. One evening in February 1982, Alvin Guerra of Fort Worth was drawn outside by a flash of blue light, and he saw this grayish, stealth-like craft hovering, he says, about 75 feet over his house. And he heard a female voice say, "Don't be afraid. Cooperate. We won't hurt you." Immediately, a beautiful tall woman with pale skin and blonde hair appeared next to him. According to Alvin, she was wearing a light blue jumpsuit. She immediately approached him and said again, "Don't be afraid." So as she is standing next to him, a mist formed around her and Alvin suddenly found himself presumably inside this craft. He said it felt quite chilly inside. He noticed several containers about the size of a human body, which the female ET told him were for rejuvenation. He was taken to the control room, where he saw more of these human figures, all women. They brought him to a medical area, where he said he saw several small animals being examined, and Alvin himself was instructed to lie on a table where he was examined. They placed an instrument over his body, which allowed him to see a holographic image of his body. And later, during this onboard encounter, he said he had relations with one of the ETs on board. Next thing he knows, he's waking back up in his bed. His clothes are missing, as is his turquoise necklace that he had been wearing at the start of this encounter, but it was now gone. Now here is a very unusual encounter which might or might not be UFO related, but it's certainly cryptozoological. It occurred late one evening in 2004 when a young couple was driving through a South Dallas suburb when they saw what they described as a dogman, or a werewolf-like humanoid creature crossing the road right in front of them. And it was huge. They said it was 7 feet tall, bipedal, but looked like a dog, had gray-black hair, bright yellow eyes, and was so big that it crossed the road in just a few steps. It was running, and it moved off into a field. It did not seem to notice or care that it was being observed. Now, there are many other cases of sightings, but here's another humanoid one. Around noon on September 5, 2015, two people were walking along Katy Trail in Dallas, a popular walking area, when they noticed two very unusual people who they wonder if they were even human, because they were walking with a very unusual gait. According to the witnesses, it looked like these two people were wearing costumes and wigs, and were looking around them uncomfortably, as if they were trying to blend in. It happened to be a very hot day, and the clothing that these two figures were wearing was inappropriate for the weather, covered their entire bodies. So the witnesses were pretty much convinced that these were not normal people, and did report this encounter to MUFON. There you go, Crypto Mojito, Dallas, Fort Worth. I think there's quite a few more. Well, I know there are quite a few more cases. I skip over the ones that are just very brief reports of anomalous lights, which don't have a whole lot of information to provide and are frankly just not as interesting as the more detailed reports of solid craft or objects moving in ways that are clearly anomalous, and certainly the humanoid reports. So please don't consider this comprehensive by any means. In fact, I expect if I were to dive deep, visit these locations, spend a year researching, I could write an entire book on every single one of these locations. Not kidding. Okay, let's move to the next one. This was really interesting. So thank you, William. This is for you. And this is Asheville, North Carolina. And wow, I found some cases all right. And these were really interesting and include pretty much the full range of UFO cases. I didn't find as many cases as I had hoped to find in Asheville, but I found some, and some are absolutely really interesting. Here's an intriguing case which occurred in 1947, the start of the modern age of ufology. A woman, her son, and two neighbors were driving near Asheville's Recreation Park when they saw something, quote, bright as the evening star, but much, much lower than planes normally fly, and round, just as they say, like a saucer. So yeah, a brief case, but certainly sounds unusual. Here's another. 10 years later, November 6, 1957, a pretty big wave of sightings hit Asheville, and it apparently became so intense that one police officer radioed his superior, Captain Everett G. Nicholson, and asked if civil defense units had any anti-aircraft guns, presumably to be used against the huge number of UFOs being seen in this area. Now, moving along, here's a very interesting case. 4 a.m., September 22nd, 1974, a night watchman by the name of Tony Weatherman called the police when he saw a large glowing object hovering overhead for a full 15 minutes. And when he called the police, it turned out they were receiving several other calls from residents in the area. So, Patrolman William Cummings came to the area where Tony Weatherman was, and he saw this object himself. Now, he refused to comment on whether this was an actual UFO, but he did say something interesting, that the Asheville airport had actually captured this object on radar. But true to form and in line with the cover-up, the FAA later said that the returns were caused by a simple temperature inversion, which seems unlikely given that so many people were reporting this sighting. Now, 3 years later, 9 p.m., June 15, 1977, a couple was driving through Asheville when they observed a disc-shaped object. They said it was big, as big as a house. It had rows of brightly lit windows, colored lights on the bottom, and hovered in complete silence at very low altitude, just above the treetops, for about 10 minutes. It impressed them enough to report it to the National UFO Reporting Center. Another case, 1987, Stephen Bond and Susan Lightcap said that they were driving south of Asheville on US Highway 64 when they stopped because they saw this very unusual looking thing in the sky, which they described as a large, fuzzy looking yellow light. It was hovering at an estimated altitude of 1,000 feet. It made no sound, and that's when it suddenly vanished, leaving them convinced it was a genuine UFO. So Larry Fawcett, who lived in this area, interviewed many witnesses, and he said that in the next year, 1988, he documented, get this, at least 829 encounters in North Carolina alone. Now, these are just the reported ones. Again, this is much more common than people realize. Here's another case, 5:30 p.m., October 24, 1999. A gentleman employed as an executive recruiter, he and his wife saw a brilliant orange light hovering overhead in Asheville. It disappeared behind the trees, but it was just a couple of weeks later, on November 12, that they had another sighting, this time of a silver disc darting around in the sky. Now, here's a very interesting case of direct contact and apparently a healing. I interviewed this gentleman directly, firsthand. His name is Michael J. Carter, and he had his first encounter with ETs on December 28, 1989, at age 34, while living with his girlfriend in a Manhattan apartment. He woke up and saw a typical gray alien, chalk white skin, pear-shaped head, a tight-fitting silver jumpsuit, wraparound eyes, a spindly-looking body. And these encounters continued to the point that he actually sought regressive hypnosis with Dr. Gene Mundy and did recall being taken on board a ship, going into a round room with no corners, indirect lighting, all the things that we hear about. He said it was like being in a doctor's office almost when you go for an exam. That's a direct quote. But the sighting I want to talk about here occurred in 2013 when Reverend Michael Carter was living in Asheville. At this time, his right leg became very painful and swollen, and over a period of 3 days, this condition worsened quickly. So he went to the hospital and got a tragic diagnosis. Doctor told him he had a severe blood clot in his leg, in his right leg. Said it was life-threatening. He should have gone to the doctor much earlier. So the doctor prescribed a months-long treatment using blood-thinning medication and ordered Michael to return weekly for close observation. At this point, Michael's leg was swollen to twice its normal size. Now, it was on the evening of July 4, 2013, Michael was laying in bed, unable to sleep, when suddenly a human-looking figure appeared at the foot of his bed. And as Michael says, he was very big and muscular. He wore one of those cowls that monks wore back in Renaissance times. He had long blonde hair, shoulder length. He was pale. I was just stunned. And he put out his hand, I think it was his right, and this blue light came out of his palm, energy or whatever it was, and it hit me. I saw it hit me. I didn't feel anything, but then he just dissolved. So this absolutely amazed Michael. He said this figure was 7 feet tall, wore this gray robe, glowed with a white aura, but the entire experience was only seconds long. He immediately grabbed his bedside journal and wrote down what happened, but it was the next morning that he got a huge surprise. He was very excited to tell his family what happened, but as he says, I put my leg down on the floor to get out of bed, and I looked, and my legs were the same size. The right was the same size as the left. And not only was it the same size, but the veins in my leg looked like they had changed position, like they had been rerouted or something. That's the best way I can put it. So a few days later, Michael returned to his doctor for a routine checkup. The doctor was utterly shocked and asked him, "How did this happen? You were just here." Now, Michael declined to tell the doctor about the bedroom visitation and just said, "Just be happy for me." It was 2 weeks later, while meditating, that Michael saw this same figure again, and this time an additional figure, a woman. Both figures were again very strong, muscular looking, with long blonde hair. Michael feels that they were checking up on him, letting him know that they were around. In fact, he feels that his experiences have given him a strong boost in his own intuitive and healing abilities and really accelerated his spiritual growth. He's now the author of several books about UFOs and religion. He's a speaker, a healer, a human rights activist, and in fact, he was recognized by President Clinton for his efforts in community outreach and anti-racism. There you go, William. Asheville, North Carolina. It's been visited, no denying it. And I love that case involving a healing. I think this shows a very positive side to UFO contact that doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's a big part of what happens when people have direct contact with humanoids and are taken on board. It's very encouraging. So now let's move to another location. I put these two together because they were provided to me together by DS. So this is for you, DS, and these locations that I'm exploring now are Juneau, Alaska and Skagway, Alaska, which are adjoining neighboring locations. So you could look at them as one location. They're separate, but I included them together because they are very close together. They were provided to me together, and very interesting stuff here. Some really unusual cases in this one for sure. Again, I was hoping to find more cases than I did in Skagway and Juneau, but I found some really good ones, like this one. This is a very early sighting, which occurred in 1916. This is significant because at that time there was no air traffic in the Skagway-Juneau area, none at all. But on February 20th of that year, First Officer Steve York and two deckhands on the steamer Georgia, which you can see here, this is the ship, were heading from Juneau to Skagway when, at 2 a.m., strange lights appeared, blinking from white to red to green every few minutes for a period of hours. And in fact, that same night, 45 miles to the north, at the Walling Gold Mine in Berners Bay, a Mr. McGuire and other workers at the mine saw a, quote, long black object passing from one cloud to another high up in the air. They described it as looking a little bit like a zeppelin, but it turns out there were more sightings. Later that spring, two other sightings were reported of a, quote, queer-looking star, which kept moving up and down, growing dimmer, then flashing red, and finally winking out. So clearly not a star. Now here is a really amazing case, which began at 3:30 p.m. daytime on December 15, 1969, when Ken Marlowe, who owned the cargo boat Teal, and his fellow sailor Ralph Kern, saw a 20-foot wide sphere of white light hovering just above the Hawk Inlet. Now, they didn't pay too much attention to it at first, kind of passed it off as a reflection from the ice or perhaps a metallic boat, but then this object began to move towards them. This is when they realized it was unusual, so Ken grabbed a pair of binoculars and looking through them still couldn't identify this object. And it remained there for 4 hours, eventually going lower and lower and floating on the surface of the water only about a quarter-mile away, then rising suddenly upwards and flying slowly over a nearby ridge. Now the sighting wasn't over yet, because the next day, December 16 at 6 p.m., Ken was docking at the cannery at Hawk Inlet when he saw what was apparently the same light, but now it was approaching from about a half-mile away, and it came right for them, and soon it was hovering just a few yards away, and then it came directly over the mast of the boat, only about 70 feet overhead. It was hovering there in perfect silence. Ken started to radio the marine radio operator in Juneau when this object suddenly dipped in the air, and it was at this point, shortly later, that the boat's power mysteriously went out and the radio cut off. Now Ken tried to turn on the auxiliary battery power, but even that didn't work. He finally just left the boat to go inside a nearby building, and he could now see that the light coming from this object was bright enough to not only illuminate his entire boat, but the area around them. In fact, the interior of the building he was in was fully lit up by this object. So he returned to his boat to turn off the diesel-powered generator, which was, quote, just barely running. So this is unusual because it's rare that a UFO affects a diesel engine, but it did. Then, after 15 minutes, this object moved off. The generator immediately returned to normal. But, as it turned out, the batteries on the boat were now dead. They had to be recharged. The engine was checked over, and nothing wrong was found. 4 years later, late one evening in mid-August 1973, a gentleman by the name of Wayne Smallwood Jr. and his friend were near Cedar Park watching the moon through telescopes when they noticed, quote, a small glowing object. It was close, near the top of a telephone pole, but they looked at it through their telescope and they could see it had green points on either side. In fact, as Wayne says, it looked like a bright boiled egg yolk with a needle stuck through it. The points on each side were giving off a green glow, which would get brighter, then duller. They weren't the only ones who saw it. There were 3 other witnesses. After 20 minutes, it finally left. Here's another really astonishing case, which occurred in the small village of Cake. This is south of Juneau. It's only got about 600 people who live in this town. And it was mid-January 1980 when resident Marvin Kadake was the first to see this bright glowing object moving up the Kiku Strait to the south. And as Marvin says, it was moving at a rapid pace, a bright orange ball color. It slowed down to a very slow pace, and it hovered over the town here. The whole town just about came out to look at it. It looked like a flying saucer. Another resident, Jana Jackson, said, "We could see it pretty good. There was flames on top. It wasn't too far away." So this object stopped pretty much right over the town, remained there for 10 minutes, then began to move off fairly quickly, made a sharp 90-degree turn, began blinking on and off, and then darted off at high speed. Again, it was completely silent the whole town, and no surprise, became the talk of the town for some time. Now, one final, really dramatic case occurred in November 1996 when Cindy, who requested her last name be withheld, left Skagway and was driving to Atlin. And she was near the 6 Mile River, came around a corner and saw a gigantic UFO. Stunned by its appearance, she stopped the car. The next thing she knows, she's standing outside the car. She did not remember getting out of the car. But at this point, a voice telepathically told her to follow this little light that was now hovering about 100 feet ahead and 30 feet up, right above the road. So she got back in her car and did. She followed it, and it guided her all the way to Atlin. Now, this is a trip which should have taken about 3 hours, but it took about 9 hours. And she arrived at her destination at 3 a.m. Now, she was going to a building which should have been locked up, but it wasn't. In fact, when she got to this building, the door was unlocked, the lights were on, the bed was made. She thought that the people who lived there must have been expecting her and prepared for her. And this turned out to be a huge mystery because she went to thank the owner the next day for being so courteous. He was very puzzled and told her that he didn't even know she was coming, that the building had actually been locked and the lights were off. But they weren't. Now, it turns out she has had prior encounters. 1 year earlier, while living in Juneau, she saw strange lights hovering near Douglas Island, and in fact noticed them for several nights. So this probably was a precursor to what is quite obviously a much closer encounter. So there you go, DS. Juneau and Skagway do have a history of encounters reaching back more than 100 years. One involving missing time, some very high strangeness encounters, some obvious UFO displays. So I think I did pretty good. I hope so. So thank you for providing that location. And yeah, still after 40 years, I'm learning new stuff. It's an endlessly fascinating subject. So now let's move to our last location in this episode for today. And this location actually was requested by 2 of you. The location is Bradenton, Florida. It was requested by Marlena and John Labant. So thank you guys for providing this location. I found some crazy cases on this one. In fact, one was so amazing, I had to save it for a future episode. Sorry. I wanted to include it, but this episode was already getting long already, and I wanted to do, again, a deeper dive into it, see if I could find more information. These episodes take a lot of research, so please have mercy on me again if you guys are going to provide another location for me to look up, because, yeah, my list is like over 600 locations. This takes a lot of work. But let's just get started on Bradenton, and I think you'll be really impressed by what I found. So Bradenton, Florida is the last location we'll be exploring tonight, and it's certainly delivered some amazing accounts. In fact, one was so weird I'm saving it for later. The first one I could find occurred on January 27, 1949, and I think the only reason this one got any attention whatsoever is because the main witness, Eckerman Sands, was the acting chief of the aircraft branch at Eglin Air Force Base. On that evening, Eckerman and his wife were driving between Cortez and Bradenton on Cortez Road when they saw what they described as a, quote, cucumber-shaped object. You can see his drawing of it here. He says they used binoculars and saw that this object was quite large, about the size of 2 train cars, he estimates. It had 7 luminous, squarish portholes. It appeared to be emitting bright red sparks out of one end. And in fact, they saw it twice. First at 10:20 p.m., traveling northwards at an estimated 8,000 feet altitude, descending, and apparently landing behind some trees, quite some distance away, 8 miles or so. But it was 1 hour later that they saw it heading north, this time making a turn to the west, descending, and then climbing up with this weird bouncing motion. It would go thousands of feet up, and then swing down, and then go up again, ultimately climbing up at about 500 miles per hour up to 40,000 feet altitude, where they lost sight of it. Here's another case which caught the attention of Project Blue Book. This occurred at 8:45 on January 6, 1955, and the main witness is Keith Brakens. He was a member of the 305th Tactical Hospital Group at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, and was with 2 other airmen, also members, Don Roberts and Clyde Thorpe. They were driving along U.S. Highway 41, just 2 to 3 miles south of Bradenton, and all 3 saw what they described as a dark circular object, but it was emitting intensely bright light, very intense. It was quite low, about 1,000 feet high, 1,500 feet west of the highway, and it so impressed them that they called the police and then called the Air Force. Here's another very interesting case. 2 years later, late one night in 1957, when a gentleman by the name of Toots Maloney was walking near his home at 1st Street North. This is at Bradenton Beach, when he noticed this strange light in the sky. Now, he thought briefly this might be a shooting star, but then it did something totally unexpected. And as Toots says in his own words, "Well, sir, the next thing I know, this thing is dropping like an elevator with a broken cable, like swoosh. I darn near swallered my uppers. It kind of settled down about 50 feet off the water and just hung there with a kind of bluish light around the bottom. It looked like a cup without a handle, set upside down on a saucer. There was some yellow light coming from the middle of it, but I couldn't see nothing. I had a feeling, though, that they could see me." Now, Toots lamented that he was the only witness, nobody else was around, because as he says, "Nobody believed me. People look at you like you got a few marbles missing when you talk about flying saucers. I hope to goodness one of them lands smack dab on the new bridge right in the middle of the celebration. Then maybe folks will wake up a bit." So he's not the only witness to be frustrated when he's trying to share his encounter. Here's another amazing case which occurred on April 23, 1959, just after midnight, as a college student, Raymond Nicoud, and his companion were driving home from a track meet in Bradenton. They were at the intersection of 29th Street and 9th Avenue looking to the east when they saw it, a UFO. I'll just quote Raymond directly. He describes it vividly. As he says, "We saw a brilliant red illumination just above the horizon. The object was moving towards us. We stopped the car and got out. The light stopped within a mile or two from where we were standing. The taciturn object hovered above the treetops for almost a half minute when a beam of white light projected downward from the disk." So yeah, this object was totally quiet, and as they watched, more beams came out, and they got the distinct impression that this disc-shaped object was searching for something on the ground. After a few moments, the beams suddenly shut off, the disc rotated onto its edge, it flashed through all the colors of the rainbow, from red to blue-white, and then it sped off to the south at 2 to 3 times the speed of a jet. Or, as Raymond says, he estimates, over 1,000 miles per hour. Here's a very unusual case of direct contact with a humanoid being. This occurred at 5 p.m. one evening in November 1971 to a police officer by the name of Gerald Myers. He had just finished his shift, and he stopped, as he often did after work, near the inland waterway to relax. And this is when he heard a strange buzzing noise, and locating the source, he was amazed to see this shimmering vortex hovering just above the ground, kind of like heat waves, he said. So he moved closer and was shocked because he could now hear it in his head, so this weird noise. And it was at this point that a humanoid form emerged, hovering about 2 feet off the ground, right where this sort of heat wave vortex was. And it quickly became clear enough that he could see arms and legs and a head. He said that this humanoid form was dressed in a blue-black costume, like a spacesuit, complete with a helmet and a glass-looking faceplate. And it was at this point that a telepathic voice sounded in his head, speaking English, and it said, "Why do humans have war?" So Gerald briefly considered this question and answered, "Greed." At this point the figure became more visible. Gerald could now see a human-like face. It was mostly human, but a little bluish-gray. He could see the eyes, a thin nose, a small mouth. The figure proceeded to ask him more questions, like why humans used money, asked him about the use of atomic power and weapons. Gerald replied that he did not know the answer to these questions and would have to get back to him, at which point the figure faded away. He did tell his shift commander, who was not happy about it, who said basically to just shut up and not tell anyone about it. But Gerald was intrigued enough that he returned to this spot repeatedly over the years, hoping the figure would return, but it never did. However, there was an interesting aftermath, because following this encounter, Gerald says he began to have numerous visions and dreams of very technical-looking drawings of strange craft and flying devices powered by some sort of plasma-based system. Here's another case. 1979, teacher Jackie Miller was on Bradenton Beach when she saw a pulsing light on the horizon. And she saw it just briefly as it moved off towards Pinellas. Now later that night, a tornado struck the area. Jackie thought was quite odd. She wondered if there was some kind of connection there. But in any event, this sighting changed her viewpoint of the world. She ended up forming a UFO group because, as she says, it may be a little traumatic for someone to share their story for the first time. And people want to share their weird experiences, but they don't know who they can trust without being judged. Just a few more cases here. November 18, 2002, a mother and daughter were staying up late to watch the Leonid meteor showers for the daughter's school science project when they saw something that was definitely not a meteor. As the witness says, it was not a shooting star because it was moving in a horizontal direction, and a second star moved towards the first, and we noticed several of these star-looking objects moving all around. They appeared to stay in pairs. We saw them come to abrupt stops in mid-flight, make right-angle turns, and do 360-degree circles. They made a full circle in their area and would make a 90-degree turn or shoot across the sky. They appeared to be dancing across the sky in pairs, except for the lone star. My daughter and I woke my husband up, and he too came out and saw the phenomena. So yeah, these are clearly not shooting stars. And it was almost exactly 1 year later, on November 15, 2003, at 5:30 p.m., that a man and his two daughters were driving along State Route 64 in Bradenton when one of his daughters suddenly shouted out, "What is that in the sky?" And looking up, the father saw a glowing object come to a stop in mid-air. And as he says, my daughter then pointed out another object, and my other daughter also saw one, for a total of 3. I have no idea what they were, but I've never seen an object move that fast and then stop and come to a hover. A moment later, there was a bright flash, and the object that I originally saw was gone, followed by 2 more flashes in sequence, and the other 2 objects were gone. One final case, researched by MUFON field investigator George Hopper. It was 8 p.m., October 22, 2016. 2 witnesses used binoculars to observe an object that they said looked like 2 long white fluorescent bulbs with a reddish light at the base, kind of giving the UFO the appearance of a triangular shape. This is the interior was dark, but would give off red and blue flashes, and they watched it for a full 20 minutes until it finally departed. There you go, a whole laundry list of cases of all kinds reaching way back to 1949 all the way up to 2016. Pretty darn recent. Cases involving direct contact with humanoids. Again, with that theme we see so often, ETs showing great concern for our violence and use of nuclear material in any capacity. Definitely some interesting cases. So thank you very much, you guys, for providing that location, Marlena and John. I learned a lot. So that's it for today. 10 locations all over our planet, mostly US, I admit. But, you provide the locations and I will look them up. So yeah, from England and Canada as well. Full range of cases, all kinds of evidence supporting them. The time for skepticism is over. There are far too many cases to deny. It's that simple. As much as our government would like to explain all of these away, or when I say governments, secret governments, cabal, intelligence agencies, top levels of the military-industrial complex, they have worked very hard to debunk this subject while knowing full well it's real, and have us believe that all encounters can be explained as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness, which is laughable. I mean, the cases in this episode alone should be enough to convince the thickest-skinned skeptic. It's my opinion, just presenting the facts as we know them. You can make up your own minds about it. So thanks once again for watching. You truly appreciate it, you guys. I'm doing this research for you. And to be honest, for myself, because I'm still trying to figure things out, but for everyone on this planet. We all deserve to know the truth about what's going on. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I truly appreciate you guys tuning in. And until next week, keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Keep asking those hard questions. It's up to you to do it. And most important of all, keep having fun. Because if you're not having fun, what are you doing? I will see you all next Friday. Bye for now.